"You spend your last dollar for me. I have to bear you a child," said the slave Apache woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The northern plains carried a heavy stillness that afternoon as wagons creaked through the open yard of the trading post, and the smell of sweat, horses, and sun-baked wood drifted with the slow wind. Caleb Ward stepped out of the supply shed holding a small sack of nails and a folded paper of salt, his boots pressed in a dry soil that crumbled under each step. He had come into town because his fence line had collapsed after a restless night of wind, and he needed nails before the cattle wandered off. He also needed salt to stretch the small bit of meat left in his cabin pantry. There was no extra money for anything else. He had counted his coins 3 times before riding in, hoping he wouldn't be forced to choose between repairs and food. Caleb was 36, thin from work, with sunburns settled into the lines around his eyes. His dark hair was uneven where he had trimmed it with a pocket knife. He rarely spoke unless necessary. Losing his younger brother during a cattle drive accident 4 years earlier had quieted him more than anything else ever had. Since then, he lived alone on a small homestead north of the ridge, tending a modest herd and avoiding crowds. He didn't like noise, questions, or people staring too long. He preferred places where he could see the horizon without interruption. He intended to leave the trading post quickly, but the crowd near the holding pen slowed his steps. Buyers argued loudly, raising dust as they paced around the wooden rails. Caleb tried to pass without looking, but the sound of someone stumbling inside the pen made him glance over. A small group of Apache captives stood huddled together. Some shifted nervously. Others watched the ground. None looked hopeful. One woman stood slightly apart from them. Her bare feet rested on cracked boards. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands across her shoulders, and her frayed deerskin dress showed signs of rough travel. Her thinness suggested weeks of poor food. She kept her eyes lowered, but not in defeat, more in the way of someone who had learned attention brought danger. Caleb felt something tighten inside him at the sight. He recognized that posture. He had seen it in his brother during their last night together, when fear had settled into him like a cold he couldn't shake. Caleb wasn't looking to save anyone. He wasn't even looking to involve himself. His only goal was to buy his supplies and get home before dusk. His horse had a swollen ankle from stepping into a prairie dog hole the day before, and he didn't want to ride in darkness. But his feet remained planted near the pen. A drunken trader shoved through the crowd, carrying a half-empty bottle. His eyes were red, and his shirt hung open. He swaggered toward the pen with an unfocused grin. When he spotted the young woman, he muttered something under his breath and reached through the rails, grabbing her arm without hesitation. She didn't fight. Her muscles stiffened in a way that showed she had learned resistance made things worse. Caleb felt heat rise up the back of his neck. He wasn't a man who looked for conflict, but seeing the trader yank her forward brought back the image of his brother being pulled under a collapsed rail during the accident. Helpless, frightened, unable to defend himself. Caleb's pulse thudded hard against his ribs. He stepped closer without meaning to. "Let go of her," he said quietly. The trader turned, confused at first, then irritated. "What for?" he snapped. Caleb didn't raise his voice. "Release her." The man tightened his grip, pulling the woman harder as if to show he didn't take orders from strangers. The woman's fingers curled inward as she braced her weight to keep from falling. Caleb's jaw locked. He didn't like how easily anger climbed up his spine in moments like this. It made him feel reckless, and recklessness was what had cost his brother his life. The trader suddenly announced a price, far more than what the woman looked to be worth in a trade, an amount given only to spite the interference. Caleb's stomach turned. He knew exactly how much he had left in his pocket. $1. Enough for a small sack of flour or a jar of oil, if rationed well. Not enough to cover what winter would bring. The trader laughed. "You want her? Pay it." Caleb didn't know what pushed him forward. Maybe the way she didn't flinch. Maybe the way she looked like she expected the ground to hit her again. Maybe the memory of his brother's face when he realized no help was coming. Whatever the reason, Caleb reached into his pocket and placed his last dollar on the rail. His chest tightened as the coin left his fingers. No food, no margin for repairs. Just a choice he couldn't justify in words. The trader snatched the dollar and shoved the woman toward Caleb with careless force. She stumbled but caught herself, pulling the torn strap of her dress up with a quick motion. Her eyes stayed to the ground. Caleb removed his coat, worn and patched, and held it out to her with one hand. He made sure not to step too close. She hesitated, not knowing his intention. Caleb kept his voice low. "It's yours. Wear it." She took the coat gingerly, as if unsure it wasn't a trick. When she wrapped it around her shoulders, her breath hitched faintly, though she hid most of her reaction behind lowered lashes. Caleb gestured toward his horse. "We're leaving." She followed, but her steps were slow from exhaustion. When she reached the saddle, she waited, not knowing if she would be pulled, pushed, or lifted. Caleb pointed to the stirrup. "Climb when you're ready." Her fingers shook slightly as she mounted. Caleb saw it, but didn't comment. Once she settled her weight, he placed the nails and salt behind the saddle, swung up, and kept enough space between them so she wouldn't feel trapped. Her shoulders dropped a fraction at the distance he left. It wasn't trust, but it was the beginning of something she didn't know how to name yet. They started across the plains in a direction away from town. Caleb let the horse move at an easy pace to keep her steady. Her back was rigid, and she held the coat tightly with one hand. She kept waiting for him to speak, to demand something, to announce what her new purpose would be. He said nothing. Caleb's thoughts churned quietly. What was he supposed to do with her? He didn't have extra food. He didn't have extra blankets. He didn't have the temperament for caretaking. Yet the thought of leaving her anywhere near that trading post made his stomach twist. After several miles, she shifted slightly from discomfort. Caleb slowed the horse without comment. She glanced at him, startled by the simple act of adjusting pace for her comfort. No one had done that for her in months, maybe years. The ridge of his homestead came into view, small cabin, leaning fence, wide expanse of grass that bent with the evening wind. Caleb felt tension creep into him as they approached. He wasn't used to sharing his space. He wasn't sure he knew how, but he couldn't turn back. "You'll rest there tonight," he said quietly. She didn't respond, but her grip on the coat softened. Behind them, the trading post faded into a blur of dust, noise, and heat. Ahead waited a cabin that had seen 4 years of silence. And between them sat a choice neither had sought, but both were now bound to see through. The sun lowered behind the ridge as the horse carried them into the first uncertain stretch of their shared path. The sun dipped low by the time Caleb guided the horse toward the small rise where his cabin stood. The wind had cooled, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and old earth. Sonia held the coat tight as they approached the worn structure. She expected shouting, commands, or some form of punishment. Every man she had encountered for months had announced his intentions before she even stepped off a horse. Caleb remained silent, which unsettled her more than anger would have. The cabin looked simple, hand-built boards, a stone chimney, and a single shutter hanging unevenly. To Sonia, it was unfamiliar ground, but at least no voices came from inside. Caleb dismounted first, landing softly on the dirt. He kept one hand on the reins and said, "Go slow. You're tired." His tone held no impatience, only observation. She slid off the saddle with stiff legs and steadied herself. Caleb watched long enough to ensure she didn't fall, then stepped aside so she could move freely. He unhooked the supplies from the saddle and walked toward the door, pushing it open with a controlled motion. He didn't gesture for her to hurry. He didn't pressure her to enter. She stood there waiting for an order that never came. "You can go in," he said at last, keeping his voice level. "No one else is here." Sonia crossed the threshold with guarded steps. The cabin was small, just one room. A bed stood against the far wall, its blanket rough but clean. A wooden table sat beneath the window with 2 mismatched chairs beside it. A shelf held tin cups, a kettle, and a few jars of dried beans. Everything had been arranged with careful precision. There was no clutter, no sign of another person living there. The stillness felt heavy, but not threatening. Caleb set the nails and salt on the table. He noticed the way her eyes moved from corner to corner, as if checking for escape routes. He had seen that same look in skittish horses, creatures who didn't yet believe the danger was behind them. "I'll start the stove," he said, giving her space. He crouched and struck a match, feeding the small flame into the dry kindling. The fire caught, sending a soft glow across the room. Sonia didn't move. She stood with her back to the wall, hands gripping the coat collar. She didn't understand why he hadn't tied her hands or blocked the door. Men who traded women never trusted them to stand freely. Caleb removed his hat and placed it on a hook. "You can sit if you want," he said, "or stay standing. Whatever feels better." She watched his posture, stooped slightly forward, shoulders drawn in, not aggressive, just worn. His silence was different from the silence she'd known among captors. Their silence had been a threat waiting to break. His silence seemed like habit, something he had carried for years because speaking offered nothing to his life. He lifted a tin pot, filled it with water from a bucket, and set it on the stove to warm. "You'll eat soon," he said without turning toward her. Sonia shifted her weight. Her stomach tightened from hunger, but she didn't trust the offer. She had been fed before only to be demanded payment afterward. She waited for the rest of the sentence that usually followed such promises. "And then you will serve me." It never came. Caleb ladled beans into the pot. The scent rose slowly, mixing with the heat from the stove. Sonia's hands trembled when the smell reached her, but she kept her face still. Showing need had been dangerous before. Caleb placed a bowl on the table. "Food's almost ready." He didn't look at her while he spoke. He didn't try to coax her forward. He simply prepared the meal as if feeding another person was ordinary. She finally stepped closer, her feet dragging slightly. Caleb noticed but said nothing. When he filled the bowl and set a spoon beside it, he took 3 steps back and sat on the chair nearest the window. He kept his hands on his knees, ensuring she saw both of them. "Eat what you can," he said. Sonia lowered herself onto the chair opposite him. Her movements were slow, careful. She tasted the food in tiny bites, watching in between each one. He remained still, staring out the window at the darkening plains. His jaw tightened occasionally, not from anger, but from the tension of someone who always expected things to collapse without warning. As she finished the meal, her stomach adjusted to the unfamiliar weight of real food. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at the cabin again. No cages, no ropes, no closed shutters. A small wooden latch hung loose on the door, the kind that wouldn't hold if someone pushed hard enough. "Where do I sleep?" she asked, her voice raw. Caleb pointed to the corner near a crate stacked with folded blankets. "There, if you want." He stood up, walked to his bed, and sat down. "Door stays unlocked," he added. "You can leave if you choose." The words hit her strangely. Choice was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Leaving was impossible. She had no food, no horse, no direction. But the fact that he offered it disarmed her more than any threat. Caleb removed his boots and lay back, placing one arm over his forehead. He didn't expect her to talk. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask for anything at all. Sonia watched him for a long time, waiting for the moment his patience slipped and his real intentions showed. But all she heard was the steady breath of a tired man lying down after a long day. She took a blanket from the crate and rested it on the floor. The boards were firm but not cold. She curled beneath the blanket with her back to the room, her fingers gripping the edge. For the first time in months, no one demanded anything after nightfall. No orders came. No footsteps approached in the dark. Caleb's breathing stayed even, and Sonia's eyes slowly closed, her mind torn between exhaustion and suspicion. The cabin held 2 people who did not know what to make of each other, but both understood how fragile the next morning would be. And as the fire dimmed to a warm glow, the first night of their uneasy, uncertain bond settled around them, quiet and unforced, shaped entirely by a man who spoke little and a woman who didn't yet believe freedom could exist inside 4 walls. Light slipped into the cabin slowly the next morning, pale and cool, settling across the wooden floor in uneven stripes. Sonia woke before Caleb stirred. She sat up carefully, unsure how much time had passed. The night had been the first in months where no hands grabbed her awake, no voices barked orders, and no footsteps circled nearby. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost deceptive. Caleb lay on his back on the narrow bed. His breathing was steady, not loud, but heavy with a kind of exhaustion she recognized in men who worked without pause. One arm rested over his chest, the other draped off the side of the bed, fingers slightly curled. He didn't look threatening. He looked worn out, like someone who carried too many miles inside his bones. Sonia quietly folded the blanket she had used and placed it back on the crate. Her stomach tightened from hunger again, but she waited. She had learned long ago that eating without permission could lead to punishment. She remained standing near the wall, unsure if she should stay still or move outside to avoid angering him. Caleb finally opened his eyes. He didn't jolt awake. He eased into consciousness with the slow adjustment of a man used to being alone. When he saw her standing stiffly near the corner, he rubbed his face and sat up. "You don't have to stand there," he said, voice rough from sleep. "You're not in trouble." Sonia nodded faintly but didn't sit. Caleb pushed the blanket off his legs, put on his boots, and went to the door. He stepped outside without saying where he was going. The cold morning air rushed in before the door closed behind him. She waited a few moments before inching toward the window. Outside, Caleb stood beside the well, cranking the bucket up with slow, practiced movements. His shoulders hunched slightly from the strain, but he didn't complain aloud. He carried the bucket back inside and set on the table. "You can wash up," he said, stepping back again. "Water's clean." She dipped her hands in cautiously. The cold shocked her fingers, but it felt grounding. She cupped water to her face, wiping away dirt that had clung to her since capture. Caleb watched only long enough to ensure she understood, then busied himself with the stove. He heated what remained of yesterday's beans and added a handful of dried oats to stretch the meal. His movements were efficient. No wasted gestures, no fumbling. Sonia noted how he kept his distance even in the small space, turning his body slightly so she wouldn't feel cornered. When the food was ready, he filled 2 bowls and placed them on the table. "Eat as much as you want," he said. "There's no limit here." Sonia hesitated. She approached slowly, waiting for some sign of what he expected in return. Caleb slid into the chair opposite and took a bite without looking at her. She finally sat down and ate in careful, steady spoonfuls. Halfway through, she asked, "Why am I here?" Caleb didn't flinch at the question. He swallowed his food and answered plainly, "Because leaving you there didn't sit right with me. That is all." "That's all," he said, eyes on the table. She studied his face closely. There was no hidden satisfaction, no smirk, no signal of ownership. His answer bothered her in a strange way. Simple kindness felt less trustworthy than cruelty, she understood. After they finished eating, Caleb stepped outside again. She followed at a distance, unsure if he wanted her near. He didn't push her away. He pointed toward the corral where his horse stood. "I need to check her leg," he said. "You can walk around if you want. The land's open." She looked across the plains, miles of grass rolling in uneven waves, a few scattered rocks, nothing to hide behind, and no path visible beyond the cabin. Freedom without direction felt more like being suspended in air rather than grounded. Sonia walked a short distance, testing the dirt under her feet. She bent to pick up a small stone, turning it between her fingers. Caleb noticed her doing this, but didn't interrupt. He knelt beside the horse's leg, gently feeling the swollen area with careful hands. His face tightened as he judged the injury. She returned to the cabin doorway, watching him work. He glanced up. "She stepped wrong yesterday," he explained. "Need to rest her a few days." Sonia wondered what that meant for her. Would he leave her behind somewhere once the horse healed? Would he return her to town? She hated that her thoughts always circled back to escape or survival, never to stability. Caleb stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. "You don't have chores unless you want them," he said. "No one's expecting anything out of you here." The words had weight. Not the loud kind, more the grounding kind. She didn't know how to respond. For months, every waking moment had been dictated by someone else's orders. Having none made her feel unsteady, like learning how to walk again. She stepped inside and began sweeping the floor with a worn broom leaning against the wall. Caleb saw her through the open door, but didn't interfere. He let her choose the task and didn't correct her movements. When she finished, she set the broom back exactly where she found it. Caleb walked in, nodded once, and said, "Thank you." The simplicity of the acknowledgement caught her off guard. Captors never said thank you. Caleb boiled more water and filled a small tin cup before placing it near her on the table. "For drinking," he said, "not rationed." Her hand hovered over the cup at first. The permission felt unfamiliar. When she finally raised it to her lips, the warmth surprised her more than the taste. Caleb leaned against the doorframe and looked out at the plains. A troubled line formed between his brows. She recognized concern, but not directed at her, directed inward, at whatever responsibility he had taken on without thinking it through. "You can tell me if you want something," he said. "If you want to stay quiet, that's fine too." Sonia lowered the cup, gripping it with both hands. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "That's allowed," Caleb replied. The words softened something deep inside her. Not comfort, but a shift, a loosening of the constant tension she carried. The morning passed slowly, each moment stacking into something she didn't yet understand. For the first time since her capture, the day unfolded without demands, schedules, or punishments. Just tasks chosen freely and a quiet man who didn't reach for her, didn't control her, didn't ask for anything except honesty when she felt safe enough to give it. By noon, a cautious rhythm formed between them, separate but not distant, familiar but not intimate, uncertain yet strangely steady. Two strangers living under one roof, learning how to breathe again without waiting for the next blow. By late afternoon, the air changed in a way Caleb recognized from years of living alone on the plains. The wind sharpened, turning from warm gusts to short, cold bursts that rattled the grass. Above the ridge, a heavy cluster of dark clouds formed, pressing low enough to make the horizon look narrower than before. Caleb stood outside the cabin with his hand resting on the fence post, watching the sky in silence. Sonia stepped out after him, uncertain why he had stopped working. She followed his gaze upward and felt a flicker of unease. She had lived through storms and captivity that turned nights into chaos. Shouting men, overturned wagons, wet shirts slapped across skin, horses panicking until someone hit them quiet. Storms had never meant safety to her. Caleb noticed the worry in her shoulders. "It'll rain hard," he said. "Not long, but strong." He spoke it calmly, as if trying to give her a foundation that wasn't built on fear. He moved quickly, checking the windows and tightening the shutter latch so the wind wouldn't rip the wood free again. Sonia watched him work with a steadiness that surprised her. He wasn't rushing out of panic, just doing what needed to be done. Every movement was deliberate, confident, informed by experience rather than anxiety. Inside the cabin, she knelt beside the stove and added more wood, remembering the cold of the night before she was captured. Caleb saw her tending the fire without being asked and didn't hide the appreciation in his eyes. He didn't speak it aloud, but the subtle nod he gave her carried more respect than any words she had heard in months. Thunder rolled across the plains as Caleb shut the door behind them. Rain struck the roof in quick, harsh bursts. The noise filled the cabin with a low, steady pressure. Sonia flinched at the first sharp crack overhead. Caleb noticed, but didn't comment. He didn't reach for her or ask questions. He just moved to hang his coat on the wall so it wouldn't drip onto the floor. She took the smallest step closer to the stove, drawing warmth into her hands. The flicker of the flames reflected faintly on her face, bringing a hint of color back into her cheeks. Caleb grabbed a small tin cup and filled it with hot water, adding a pinch of dried roots he used for comfort during cold spells. He set the cup on the table and slid it toward her slowly, making sure the gesture didn't feel like a command. "Help settle the cold," he said. She hesitated before taking it. When she lifted it to her lips, she tasted something earthy and unfamiliar, but the heat soothed her throat. Her body loosened slightly. It was the first warm drink she'd had since her village was raided. Wind slammed against the wall, and Sonia's fingers tightened around the cup. Caleb crouched down to check the stove grate, giving her distance but staying close enough so she wouldn't feel abandoned. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "You're safe here," he said. Not loud, not forceful, just honest. Sonia's eyes lowered. "Storms, they brought trouble before." "Not this one," Caleb replied softly. "Roof holds. Walls don't shake." She stared at the floorboards, remembering nights of no shelter, violent hands, and freezing air. The cabin light pulsed across her face, making the shadows on her skin look deeper. Caleb saw how her breath hitched each time thunder cracked overhead, and he adjusted the stove door so the firelight stayed strong. "Sit if you want," he said, gesturing to the bed's edge. "Warmer there." She stepped toward it slowly, testing his words. When she settled on the edge, she folded her hands tightly in her lap. Caleb leaned against the wall near the window, keeping his distance but staying within her line of sight. The storm strengthened. Wind shoved against the shutters, and rain beat down in sheets. Sonia pressed her lips together and stared at the flames, working to steady her breathing. Caleb watched her face carefully. He could almost sense her mind drifting back into places she didn't want to revisit. He knew the signs. He'd lived them too. To interrupt the silence before it slipped into fear, he spoke quietly. "You don't have to tell me anything, but you can." She didn't answer immediately. She listened to the storm. She watched how Caleb's posture stayed grounded instead of tense. Something in that steadiness gave her a little courage. "I thought the storm last month would kill me," she whispered, eyes fixed on her hands. "Cold water, rope burns, no food left." Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't know her history, but the pieces were enough to understand more than she said aloud. "I'm sorry you lived that," he said. Her eyes flicked up, not expecting apology, not sure how to respond to it. No one had ever apologized for what she endured. "You're not like them," she said quietly. Caleb took a slow breath. "I don't want to be." Rain hammered the roof again, heavy and insistent. Sonia slid the cup between her palms several times, focusing on the faint warmth. Caleb turned his head toward the window, checking the shutter's movement. "Storm's passing soon," he said. "You'll hear the wind lighten first." As if answering him, the gusts softened slightly, the pressure easing. Sonia looked toward the window as if she didn't believe it. Caleb gave a faint nod. "See? It's already changing." Minutes later, the rain slowed, then tapered into a soft patter. The worst had passed. Sonia breathed a little deeper, the trembling leaving her fingers. Caleb stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to show acknowledgement. "You handled it," he said simply. The statement landed in her chest like an unfamiliar weight. Recognition without expectation, respect without price. She lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time since arriving, she didn't look away immediately. The storm had stripped something raw between them, leaving space where fear had been sitting before. Outside, water dripped in quiet steadiness from the eaves, and the plains glistened under the clearing sky. Inside the cabin, two people who barely understood each other shared a silence that felt different than the day before. Warmer, steadier, shaped by endurance rather than survival. A silence that hinted they might begin trusting the world again, one storm at a time. By late afternoon, the air changed in a way Caleb recognized from years of living alone on the plains. The wind sharpened, turning from warm gusts to short, cold bursts that rattled the grass. Above the ridge, a heavy cluster of dark clouds formed, pressing low enough to make the horizon look narrower than before. Caleb stood outside the cabin with his hand resting on the fence post, watching the sky in silence. Sonia stepped out after him, uncertain why he had stopped working. She followed his gaze upward and felt a flicker of unease. She had lived through storms in captivity that turned nights into chaos. Shouting men, overturned wagons, wet shirts slapped across skin, horses panicking until someone hit them quiet. Storms had never meant safety to her. Caleb noticed the worry in her shoulders. "It'll rain hard," he said. "Not long, but strong." He spoke it calmly, as if trying to give her a foundation that wasn't built on fear. He moved quickly, checking the windows and tightening the shutter latch so the wind wouldn't rip the wood free again. Sonia watched him work with a steadiness that surprised her. He wasn't rushing out of panic. just doing what needed to be done. Every movement was deliberate, confident, informed by experience rather than anxiety. Inside the cabin, she knelt beside the stove and added more wood, remembering the cold of the night before she was captured. Caleb saw her tending the fire without being asked and didn't hide the appreciation in his eyes. He didn't speak it aloud, but the subtle nod he gave her carried more respect than any words she had heard in months. Thunder rolled across the plains as Caleb shut the door behind them. Rain struck the roof in quick, harsh bursts. The noise filled the cabin with a low, steady pressure. Sonia flinched at the first sharp crack overhead. Caleb noticed, but didn't comment. He didn't reach for her or ask questions. He just moved to hang his coat on the wall so it wouldn't drip onto the floor. She took the smallest step closer to the stove, drawing warmth into her hands. The flicker of the flames reflected faintly on her face, bringing a hint of color back into her cheeks. Caleb grabbed a small tin cup and filled it with hot water, adding a pinch of dried roots he used for comfort during cold spells. He set the cup on the table and slid it toward her slowly, making sure the gesture didn't feel like a command. "Help settle the cold," he said. She hesitated before taking it. When she lifted it to her lips, she tasted something earthy and unfamiliar, but the heat soothed her throat. Her body loosened slightly. It was the first warm drink she'd had since her village was raided. Wind slammed against the wall, and Sonia's fingers tightened around the cup. Caleb crouched down to check the stove grate, giving her distance but staying close enough so she wouldn't feel abandoned. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "You're safe here," he said. Not loud, not forceful, just honest. Sonia's eyes lowered. Storms, they brought trouble before. "Not this one," Caleb replied softly. "Roof holds. Walls don't shake." She stared at the floorboards, remembering nights of no shelter, violent hands, and freezing air. The cabin light pulsed across her face, making the shadows on her skin look deeper. Caleb saw how her breath hitched each time thunder cracked overhead, and he adjusted the stove door so the firelight stayed strong. "Sit if you want," he said, gesturing to the bed's edge. "Warmer there." She stepped toward it slowly, testing his words. When she settled on the edge, she folded her hands tightly in her lap. Caleb leaned against the wall near the window, keeping his distance but staying within her line of sight. The storm strengthened. Wind shoved against the shutters, and rain beat down in sheets. Sonia pressed her lips together and stared at the flames, working to steady her breathing. Caleb watched her face carefully. He could almost sense her mind drifting back into places she didn't want to revisit. He knew the signs. He'd lived them too. To interrupt the silence before it slipped into fear, he spoke quietly. "You don't have to tell me anything, but you can." She didn't answer immediately. She listened to the storm. She watched how Caleb's posture stayed grounded instead of tense. Something in that steadiness gave her a little courage. "I thought the storm last month would kill me," she whispered, eyes fixed on her hands. "Cold water, rope burns, no food left." Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't know her history, but the pieces were enough to understand more than she said aloud. "I'm sorry you lived that," he said. Her eyes flicked up, not expecting apology, not sure how to respond to it. No one had ever apologized for what she endured. "You're not like them," she said quietly. Caleb took a slow breath. "I don't want to be." Rain hammered the roof again, heavy and insistent. Sonia slid the cup between her palms several times, focusing on the faint warmth. Caleb turned his head toward the window, checking the shutter's movement. "Storm's passing soon," he said. "You'll hear the wind lighten first." As if answering him, the gusts softened slightly, the pressure easing. Sonia looked toward the window as if she didn't believe it. Caleb gave a faint nod. "See? It's already changing." Minutes later, the rain slowed, then tapered into a soft patter. The worst had passed. Sonia breathed a little deeper, the trembling leaving her fingers. Caleb stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to show acknowledgement. "You handled it," he said simply. The statement landed in her chest like an unfamiliar weight. Recognition without expectation, respect without price. She lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time since arriving, she didn't look away immediately. The storm had stripped something raw between them, leaving space where fear had been sitting before. Outside, water dripped in quiet steadiness from the eaves, and the plains glistened under the clearing sky. Inside the cabin, two people who barely understood each other shared a silence that felt different than the day before. Warmer, steadier, shaped by endurance rather than survival. A silence that hinted they might begin trusting the world again, one storm at a time. The evening settled slowly over the plains, dimming the sky into a quiet blend of gray and pale orange. Caleb returned from the pasture with his sleeves rolled up and dust clinging to his arms. He had spent the last hour reinforcing the gate, wanting to ensure no stray cattle wandered during the night. His shoulders ached from the work, but the simple routine helped him think more clearly. Inside the cabin, Sonia stood near the stove, stirring a pot with measured movements. She hadn't asked him what he wanted for supper. She had simply taken ingredients from the shelf and started cooking. Her posture carried a confidence he had not seen in her before, cautious, but no longer weighed down by immediate fear. Caleb stepped inside and shut the door against the cooling air. The sound made her turn, just slightly, enough for him to notice how her eyes tracked his movements. Not with alarm, more with curiosity, as if she was studying how he filled his own space. "Smells good," he said quietly. "It's simple," she replied, "but warm." She placed two bowls on the table, dividing the stew with careful precision. Caleb washed his hands at the basin, then sat across from her. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the faint crackle of the stove. The peace inside the cabin felt different tonight. Not fragile, not strained, just quiet in a way that held meaning neither fully understood yet. Halfway through the meal, Sonia lowered her spoon. Her fingers tapped lightly on the rim of the bowl, a small sign of tension she didn't try to hide. Caleb sensed something building in her, something she had been carrying for days. "You should know something," she said, her voice low but steady. Caleb set his spoon down and leaned back slightly, giving her space to continue. She took a slow breath, grounding herself. "When you paid that $1, I thought you wanted ownership, that you bought me." Caleb's chest tightened, not with anger, but with the weight of knowing how many men confirmed that belief. "That's not what I wanted," he said. She nodded but didn't stop. Her hands pressed together tightly on the table. "Women like me," she continued, "we survive by giving something back. A man gives food, shelter, safety. A woman answers with her body or child. That is how it has been for me. It is what I know." Caleb felt the heaviness of her words settle over the room. She was not bargaining. She was exposing something she believed to be an unbreakable rule. Sonia's eyes lifted to meet his. In them, he saw fear, not of him, but of being worthless if she offered nothing. "You spent everything you had," she whispered. "I have nothing except myself. If I do not give something to you, then why would you keep me here?" Caleb inhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. This was not a moment he could respond to with softness alone. She needed clarity, firm, undeniable clarity. "Sonia," he said, leaning forward just enough for her to feel the seriousness in his tone. "You're here because I didn't want you hurt, not because I wanted something from you." She didn't look convinced. Her lips tightened. Her shoulders stiffened again, the way they had on the day he found her. "I owe you a future," she said. "A child, if that is what you want. It is the only way I know to repay a man who sacrifices for me." Caleb's breath left him in a heavy wave. The idea hit him harder than he expected, not because he wanted it, but because she believed repayment was her only purpose. He pushed his chair back slowly and stood, placing both hands on the table for balance. "You don't owe me a child," he said firmly, "and you don't owe me your body. Not now. Not ever." Her brow furrowed, as if she couldn't understand the rules he was offering. "I don't know how to live without debt," she admitted. "You're not in debt," he answered. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Then what am I to you?" Caleb swallowed hard. He didn't have a perfect answer. He barely had a reasonable one, but she deserved a truth that gave her ground to stand on. "You're someone who didn't deserve what happened," he said. "Someone who should get to breathe without fear." Someone who gets to decide her own life. Sonia's breath shook. His words didn't match any system she had ever lived under. Choice had never been part of her survival, so she didn't know how to carry it now. She stood slowly, stepping away from the table. The movement wasn't rejection. It was searching for air, for understanding, for balance. Caleb didn't move toward her. He knew closeness was dangerous when a person felt exposed. She placed her hand on the doorframe, grounding herself with the cool wood. "If I stay, you will not expect that from me." "No," he said. "If you stay, it's because you chose to. Nothing more." She looked toward the plains stretching beyond the porch. The evening light had dimmed, leaving only a faint line of color along the horizon. Her eyes studied it, as if testing the idea of freedom against the vastness outside. She turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to choose anything." Caleb nodded once. "Then take your time. No one's rushing you." A silence settled between them, steady, unbroken, not heavy. Sonia's shoulders lowered just slightly. The tension in her hands eased. She crossed the room again, softer this time, and sat near the stove. Caleb returned to the table, picking up his bowl without speaking. The moment passed quietly, but it reshaped something between them. A boundary set, a fear named, a future not forced. Sonia didn't offer herself again that night. Caleb didn't expect her to. And inside that small cabin, under the rising chill of dusk, the first true step toward trust, not survival, took its place between them. The next several days unfolded with a rhythm neither of them planned, but both found themselves following. The storm had left the ground damp, and the plains carried a crisp smell of wet soil. Caleb rose early each morning, stepping outside before dawn to check the horse, walk the fence line, and survey the pasture for any signs of stray cattle. His movements were steady and unhurried, shaped by years of doing these tasks with no one beside him. Sonia watched him at first from the doorway, studying the way he interacted with the land. He didn't curse when tools slipped. He didn't shout at the animals. He treated everything he touched, ropes, wood, water, with quiet respect. She wasn't used to seeing a man work without anger. It unsettled her in a way she didn't expect. On the third morning, she stepped out before he returned to the cabin. The air was cold enough to sting her fingertips, but she walked farther than she had any day since arriving. She circled around the cabin, brushing her hand lightly over the rough boards. The construction was simple but strong, lacking ornament, but filled with the sense of a man who built things to last, even if only for himself. When Caleb returned, he noticed her outside, not pressed into fear, but moving with a purpose she hadn't shown before. "You slept?" he asked. She nodded. "Better." He accepted the answer without pressing further. They went inside together, a quiet that felt shared rather than separate settling between them. Sonia began preparing breakfast without being asked, boiling water, grinding the dried corn he kept in a sack beside the stove, measuring portions with a precision she had learned in harder conditions. Caleb watched from the table, noticing the confidence in her hands. Her movements no longer echoed panic. They carried intention. "You don't need to cook every time," he said. "I want to," she answered simply. It was the first voluntary declaration she had made since he brought her here. After they ate, Sonia stepped outside with the broom, sweeping dirt away from the cabin door. Caleb didn't tell her to stop or offer instructions. He let her claim responsibility in her own way, aware that she was rebuilding something inside herself every time she chose a task rather than waiting for orders. Later that afternoon, Caleb worked on reinforcing the fence near the corral. Sonia hovered nearby, unsure if she should help. He noticed her hesitation. "If you want to hand me the nails," he said, motioning toward the small box on the ground, "that'd be useful." She knelt, lifted one nail at a time, and placed them into his open palm. She watched how he positioned them, how his wrist pivoted as he hammered. She'd never been close to someone working with such concentration, but without tension. Sweat formed at his temples, but he didn't sigh or grow frustrated. "You rebuilt this fence before?" she asked. "Twice last year," he replied. "Wind can be rough out here." She glanced toward the horizon. "It feels open." Hard to hide. Nothing here tries to hide, he said. Not the land, not the weather. That's why I stay. His honesty surprised her, and she looked at him a moment longer than she meant to. Caleb noticed, but didn't mention it. He returned to the fence, tapping each nail until the wood sat firmly in place. When they finished, he leaned back against the post, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Sonia stood beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the small sense of accomplishment. Caleb broke the silence. You're getting strong again. She frowned slightly, uncertain how to take the statement. Strength had brought her trouble before. Men disliked when women carried confidence. Strong is safe here, he added, sensing her hesitation. Those 3 words settled deep in her chest. She looked down at her hands, recalling how they had once trembled constantly. They didn't anymore. That evening, Sonia sat near the stove mending a tear in her dress. Caleb sat at the table, sharpening a small knife he used for chores. The quiet between them didn't feel like the uneasy silence of strangers anymore. It carried familiarity, still cautious, still careful, but real. When the blade slipped into perfect alignment, Caleb glanced up. If you ever need cloth, I've got extra sacks in the shed, he said. You don't have to fix everything alone. I know, she replied, surprising herself with how easily the words came. The firelight cast a warm glow across the room. Sonia paused her stitching and looked toward the door. I hear no horses, no men, no danger. Not out here, Caleb confirmed. It feels different. Different good, he asked. She touched the place at her collarbone where fear usually lived. Tonight it felt smaller. Yes, she said softly. Caleb nodded once, the corner of his mouth tightening briefly. Not a smile, but something close. As night settled, Sonia placed her mended dress beside her blanket and sat on the floor with her knees drawn to her chest. Caleb lay on his bed, arms behind his head, staring at the ceiling. The cabin breathed with a slow, even calm neither had felt in a long time. It was not love. It was not obligation. It was something quieter, 2 lives settling into a rhythm that didn't hurt. For the first time since she stepped into this room, Sonia fell asleep without waiting for danger to return. For the first time in years, Caleb felt a presence inside his home that didn't weigh on him. It steadied him. And somewhere in the quiet space between those truths, a bond began forming in ways neither recognized yet. By the time the first real cold wind pushed across the plains, the days had settled into a routine neither Caleb nor Sonia openly acknowledged, but both relied on. The mornings carried a sharper bite now, forcing them to move with briskness just to stay warm. Frost clung to the grass in thin white sheets, and the breath of Caleb's horse rose in soft clouds as he checked her leg each dawn. Inside the cabin, Sonia cooked more often than before, making larger meals to combat the cold. Thicker stews, mashed corn, and reheated beans mixed with dried herbs Caleb had foraged during the summer. She handled the dishes with careful precision, drying them near the stove so the heat wouldn't warp the wood shelves. Caleb noticed her small adjustments around the cabin, stacking wood neatly, rearranging jars for easier reach, sewing patches to the worn curtain by the window. None of these acts were asked for. She chose them. One icy morning, Caleb returned from the pasture carrying a bundle of firewood. He stepped inside, shaking loose frost from his sleeves. Sonia stood near the stove, rolling dough between her palms to make simple biscuits. Steam rose from the kettle behind her, filling the air with a warmth that eased the cabin's chill. Caleb cleared his throat gently. Cold's cutting deeper today. Sonia looked toward the window where thin ice had formed along the bottom edge of the glass. Winter comes fast here, she said, her voice soft but certain. He set the firewood beside the stove. Last year came a rush. Nearly lost the roof for good. And this year, she asked. We'll handle it, he said without hesitation. The word we surprised her. It landed with more weight than she expected, as if he had spoken a truth neither of them had articulated before. She paused, pressing her fingers into the dough to steady herself. After breakfast, Caleb bundled rope and tools for fence repairs. He wasn't expecting help. He'd spent years doing everything alone, but Sonia grabbed her shawl and followed him outside with firm steps. He hesitated, not wanting to push her into work that might strain her recovering strength. "You don't need to come," he said. "I want to keep busy," she replied. He accepted her company with a thoughtful nod. Together, they walked to the damaged fence line. Caleb tightened loose rails while Sonia gathered broken wood pieces into a pile. Her pace was slow but deliberate. The wind bit their faces, turning their cheeks red. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, noticing how she no longer hunched her shoulders reflexively when he moved near her. Some of her guardedness had eased, just enough for him to see it. When they finished, they stood side by side, looking out across the frost-covered field. The cold settled thick around them, but neither made an effort to rush back. Sonia broke the quiet first. "You said something last night, before you fell asleep." Caleb frowned slightly. "I talk in my sleep?" "Not much," she said. "Just a few words." "You said?" "Not again." His face tightened. He hadn't realized he had said anything out loud. Shame flickered briefly across his features. He hated the idea of burdening her with a weight he carried. "It's nothing," he murmured. "That's not true," she said, voice gentle. It meant something. He took a slow breath. Admitting things felt unnatural to him, but lying felt worse. "It was about my brother," he said finally. "I couldn't save him. Some nights it comes back." Sonia absorbed this quietly. She didn't try to comfort him. She didn't reach for his arm. She simply stood with him, offering presence without pressure. "What happened?" she asked softly. Caleb stared across the pale field. Fence collapsed during a drive. He was pinned before I reached him. His jaw tightened. "I should have been faster." Sonia looked at him with steady eyes. "You lived. That is not nothing." He swallowed hard, hearing a strange conviction in her tone, one born from someone who had fought through her own impossible nights. They returned to the cabin in silence, each lost in separate thoughts, yet strangely aligned by the fact that both carried memories too heavy to set down. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Sonia hung her shawl on a peg and moved to the stove. Caleb set his tools down near the door and rubbed his stiff hands together. "You should rest," he said. She shook her head. "You work harder than I did. I'm used to it." "So am I," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment, realizing she wasn't trying to prove strength. She was stating a fact born from survival. Later that evening, while the wind howled faintly outside, Sonia sat on the floor, sorting dried beans into a bowl. Caleb sat at the table repairing a damaged leather strap. The fire crackled steadily, casting warm light across their faces. At one point, Caleb glanced up and found her watching him. Not with suspicion, not with fear, but with calm interest. It startled him for a second. He wasn't used to being seen without judgment. "What is it?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "You look lighter tonight." He blinked. "Lighter? Less burdened," she said. "Maybe because you spoke of your brother." Caleb set the strap down. "Talking doesn't change the past." "No," she agreed, "but it changes how you carry it." Her words held a sharp honesty he couldn't argue with. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet settle around them again. The fire dimmed as the night deepened. Sonia placed the sorted beans aside and pulled her blanket over her legs. Caleb moved to the stove and added another log, ensuring the cabin would stay warm until dawn. When he returned to his bed, he noticed Sonia's eyes were still open. "Hard asleep?" he asked. "Hard to imagine tomorrow," she said. He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow will come either way." Her lips lifted in the faintest hint of something that wasn't quite a smile, but carried warmth. "Then we face it." Caleb lay down, folding his hands behind his head. "Yes," he said quietly, "we will." Outside, the plane slept under a thin crust of frost. Inside, the cabin held two people who were no longer living in fear of each other's presence. It was not love yet. It was not promise. It was a steady step toward belonging, built one cold evening at a time. The first hints of spring crept across the plains in thin, uncertain streaks. Patches of green pushed through the last layers of frost, and the wind carried a softer tone, no longer sharp enough to bite skin. Caleb stood outside the cabin at dawn, surveying the land with a level breath. Winter had been difficult, but it had not broken them. The fence held, The roof endured, and the cabin had stayed warm through the longest nights. For a man who once survived by expecting everything to fall apart, the steadiness of these past weeks felt almost foreign. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Sonia stepped out, rubbing her arms as the morning light touched her face. The cold still lingered, but she didn't flinch from it the way she had when she first arrived. Her posture had changed. She stood taller, her shoulders no longer pulled inward. She had gained weight, subtle but visible, and her eyes carried a clarity that hadn't existed the day Caleb found her in that pen. He turned when he heard her steps. "Didn't expect you awake so early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. "Too many thoughts." Caleb nodded, understanding. The slowly warming land always carried that effect. An awakening not just in the soil, but in people who had been holding themselves tight for too long. They walked to the ridge together. The sky was wide, painted in light blues and faint streaks of pink. As they stood there, neither spoke for a while. Caleb kept his hands in his pockets, but he wasn't hiding. Sonia wrapped her shawl closer around her shoulders, but she didn't seem cold. It felt more like grounding herself. "I've been thinking," she said finally. Caleb glanced at her, weighing his response before offering it. "About what?" "About staying," she answered. "Staying here. Not because I owe you anything, but because I want a life that does not hurt every day." I did not believe such a life existed before. Caleb's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something warm and steady. "You don't have to decide all at once." "I know," she said, "but I'm no longer afraid of choosing." Her words carried a quiet confidence he had not heard from her before. He studied her face carefully and saw no trace of hesitation. Not forced hope, not desperation, just calm resolve. Caleb looked back at the cabin, his home for years, built from boards he cut, nails he hammered, sweat he gave without expectation of anyone else stepping through the door. Now, for the first time, the place looked different. Not because anything physically changed, but because someone else had shaped life inside it alongside him. "What would staying look like to you?" he asked after a long pause. Sonia folded her hands slowly. "Helping with planting, learning the land, making meals that last more than one day, sleeping without memories waking me, watching seasons pass without being moved against my will." Her eyes lifted to his. "And being beside a man who shows care without taking anything." Caleb felt something heavy loosen inside him. He had lived years believing his world was too small to share. Hearing her speak about building a life here, by choice, unsettled that belief in a good way. They walked back toward the cabin, steps slow and unforced. Caleb opened the shed to check the tools for spring planting. Sonia followed and stood near the doorway, observing the arrangement of supplies he kept in predictable order. Ropes coiled neatly, plow blades leaning against the wall, seed sacks placed high enough to avoid moisture. She ran her fingers over the handle of a shovel, testing the wood grain. "I could help in the fields," she said. "My people taught me how to plant corn before." Her voice faded, but she didn't crumble the way she once did when memory surfaced. Caleb stepped closer, but not too close. "You can teach me," he said. Her eyes widened. "Teach you? I'm not the best at growing anything except grass," he admitted. "So if you know something I don't, I'd like to learn." Sonia exhaled slowly, her expression softening. She had spent so long being talked over, commanded, silenced. Hearing him offer her knowledge respect stirred something warm through her chest. They spent the late morning preparing the soil. Caleb turned the ground with the shovel, while Sonia broke larger clumps apart with her hands. Their movements fell into natural rhythm, not rehearsed, but instinctive. She explained how her village used to bury fish scraps beneath the first planting rows to feed the soil. Caleb nodded thoughtfully and made plans to gather what he needed the next time he visited the river. As the sun climbed higher, they paused to rest near the fence. Caleb handed her a tin cup of water, and she accepted it without hesitation. A simple exchange, yet different from the early days when every gesture carried suspicion. Sonia studied the land. "I want to make something grow here," she said. "Something new." Caleb watched her profile. Steady eyes, determined jaw, a quiet strength resurfacing after months of losing everything she knew. We can plant whatever you want, he said. She set the cup down. I want corn. And beans. Maybe squash later. Then that's what we'll plant. Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile, her first since arriving. Caleb held the moment carefully in his mind, knowing how rare such a sight had been. As afternoon settled in, clouds drifted overhead, casting cool shadows across the ridge. They worked until the soil was smooth and ready for seed. When they finished, Caleb brushed dirt from his hands and looked at her with a seriousness that had been building for days. Sonia, he began, I don't want you to feel you owe me anything. But if you choose to stay, I'll make room for you here. Not as a burden, not as someone bought, but as someone who belongs because she wants to. She stepped toward him, not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could feel the change in her. I made my decision, she said. I'm staying. Not because you saved me, not because I'm afraid, because this place feels like a beginning. Caleb's throat tightened with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Then this is your home, too. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, not with sorrow, but with a quiet relief she had fought for across endless miles and too many nights of suffering. I want a future, she said softly. One built slowly, one built right. Caleb nodded. We'll build it together. Sonia reached out, hesitant at first, and placed her hand lightly over his. It was not a promise made in desperation. It was not an obligation repaid. It was a choice freely given, shaped by trust formed through weeks of silence, storms, shared meals, and patient understanding. For Caleb, that small touch carried more meaning than any vow spoken aloud. For Sonia, it marked the first moment she believed her life belonged to her again. As evening settled across the plains, the sky stretching wide and calm, the two of them stood side by side, looking at the land they would cultivate in spring. The cabin behind them no longer felt like shelter for one. It felt like a beginning for two. There were no debts left, no bargains, no fear, only the steady promise of days waiting to be shaped by their own hands. Their future, quiet, honest, chosen, had finally begun.